You walk into a gun store. You pick out what you want. You hand over your driver's license. The guy behind the counter types your name into a computer. And a few seconds later, sometimes less time than it took you to swipe your card, you get an answer. Approved. That's it. That's the whole system. At least the part you can see. Here's the thing most people never stop to think about. That few seconds didn't exist for most of American history. Not for decades after machine guns were regulated, not even for 30 years after Congress passed the first major federal gun law of the modern era. For 30 years, the answer to "Can this person legally buy a gun?" wasn't a database query. It was a signature, a form, somebody's word. So ask yourself, what happens when the system runs entirely on trust? What happens when the only thing standing between a convicted felon and a loaded gun is whether he's willing to lie on a piece of paper? And what happens when the most consequential assassination in American history was carried out with a rifle that arrived, quite literally, in the mail? Because that's where this story starts. Before this is over, you're going to meet a rifle that cost less than $20 and came wrapped in brown paper. A press secretary shot on a Washington sidewalk, live on national television. A form nobody could actually verify. A sheriff in rural Montana who single-handedly blew a federal law apart in the Supreme Court. And an FBI facility racing a hard deadline in the fall of 1998, trying to build, from scratch, a system that could check a criminal record in less time than it takes to sign your name. For 30 years, America sold guns on the honor system. It took an assassinated president, a shooting outside a hotel, and a fight that dragged through Congress for the better part of a decade to finally close that gap. This is the story of how a country that couldn't stop a rifle from arriving by mail eventually built a system that answers, instantly, whether you're allowed to own one at all. In early 1963, a 24-year-old ex-Marine named Lee Harvey Oswald sat down and filled out a coupon in the back of a gun magazine. Not a background check, not an ID card, a coupon. The kind you'd clip to order a set of steak knives or a pair of binoculars. He mailed it to a mail-order sporting goods company, Verify, commonly identified as Klein's Sporting Goods, Chicago, along with a money order for what's usually cited as somewhere around Verify featured in 1995, less than the cost of a decent dinner out today, adjusted for inflation. He didn't use his real name. He used an alias, A. Hidell, and had the rifle shipped to a P.O. box he'd rented under that same fake identity. And nobody stopped him. Not because the system failed, because there was no system to fail. In 1963, if you wanted a rifle, you didn't need a license, a permit, a waiting period, or so much as a face-to-face conversation with the person selling it to you. You needed a stamp. A few weeks later, that same rifle, ordered through the mail under a fake name, no questions asked, was found on the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository in Dallas, shortly after President John F. Kennedy was shot and killed riding through Dealey Plaza. Now, it's worth pausing here because this isn't a story about the assassination itself, and it's definitely not a conspiracy video. What matters for our purposes is much narrower, and honestly, much stranger. The ease of it. The complete absence of friction. A private citizen bought a lethal weapon anonymously through the Postal Service, the same way you might order a subscription magazine. That fact, not the conspiracy theories, not the grassy knoll, just the plain mechanical fact of how easy the purchase was, became one of the loudest arguments in the gun control debate for the rest of the decade. Because here's what a lot of people don't realize. Before 1963, Gun control as a serious national political issue barely existed. There'd been a scattered federal law here and there, mostly aimed at things like sawed-off shotguns and machine guns back in the 1930s, a response to Prohibition-era gangster violence, but ordinary rifles, shotguns, handguns, almost entirely unregulated at the federal level. States had their own patchwork of rules, wildly inconsistent, and mail-order sales blew right past most of them anyway, since a rifle ordered from a catalog in Illinois didn't have to answer to a law in Texas. The Kennedy assassination didn't immediately change that. Congress introduced gun control bills in the aftermath, and most of them died in committee, the same way earlier attempts had. The political will just wasn't there yet, not for a law with real teeth. But the country was about to get two more reasons to revisit the question, and neither of them would let Congress look away a second time. Fast forward 5 years, it's 1968, and America is coming apart at the seams. The Vietnam War is tearing the country in half on the nightly news. Cities are burning. And in the span of just 2 months that spring, the nation loses two more towering public figures to gunfire. In April, Martin Luther King Jr. is shot and killed on a motel balcony in Memphis. In June, Robert F. Kennedy, a sitting senator, a presidential candidate, brother of the president assassinated 5 years earlier, is shot in a hotel kitchen in Los Angeles, hours after winning the California primary. 3 assassinations in 5 years. A president, a civil rights leader, a presidential candidate, and running underneath all 3, the same uncomfortable thread. How easy it had been, mechanically speaking, for each gunman to get his hands on a weapon. That was enough. That was finally enough. In October of 1968, Congress passed the Gun Control Act, the first serious, comprehensive piece of federal firearms legislation in the country's history. And it's worth understanding what it actually did, because this is the law that built the skeleton of the system we still live under today, for better or worse. The Gun Control Act banned interstate mail-order sales to the general public, the exact loophole Oswald had used 5 years earlier. If you wanted a gun now, in most cases, you had to go through a licensed dealer. It created a new category of business, the Federal Firearms Licensee, or FFL. Basically, anyone who wanted to sell guns for a living now had to register with the federal government and follow federal rules, and it introduced a form, a specific piece of paper that, in one shape or another, is still filled out at gun counters across the country every single day, what eventually became known as ATF Form 4473. Here's what that form asked you to do. It asked you to answer a series of questions, under penalty of federal law, about your own eligibility to own a firearm. Have you ever been convicted of a felony? Are you a fugitive from justice? Have you ever been committed to a mental institution? You'd read the questions, you'd check the boxes, you'd sign your name. And that was it. That was the check. Think about what that actually means for a second. The entire verification process rested on the assumption that a felon, standing at a gun counter, filling out a federal form, would voluntarily tell the truth about being a felon. There was no database to cross-reference, no phone call to make, no national fingerprint check, no criminal history lookup, nothing. The dealer's job was to look at your driver's license, confirm the name on it matched the name on the form, and take your word for everything else. It wasn't nothing. That's important to say. Compared to the total absence of any system in 1963, this was real progress. Interstate mail order was dead. Licensed dealers now existed as an accountable category of business, and at least on paper, felons and fugitives were prohibited from buying. But prohibited on paper and prevented in practice turned out to be two very different things. And for the next 25 years, that gap between what the law said and what the law could actually verify just sat there, quietly, waiting. So picture what buying a gun actually looked like for the next quarter century. You walk into a store. You pick out a rifle, a shotgun, a handgun, whatever you're there for. The clerk pulls out Form 4473, slides it across the counter, and you start answering questions. Are you the actual buyer of this firearm, or are you purchasing it on behalf of someone else? Have you ever been convicted of a felony? Have you ever been dishonorably discharged from the military? Are you an unlawful user of, or addicted to, marijuana or any other controlled substance? You check the boxes. You sign it. The clerk glances at your driver's license, makes sure the name matches, maybe makes sure the address is current. And then, in the vast majority of cases across the country, that was the entire background check. No phone call, no fax, no database, nothing. It's worth sitting with how strange that actually is. This is a legally binding federal document. Lying on it is a felony in itself, punishable by years in prison. But the only enforcement mechanism was catching someone after the fact, usually after that gun had already been used in a crime, and proving they'd lied on the form to begin with. There was no mechanism in the moment, at the counter, to stop a sale before it happened. Some states did better than others. A handful had their own state-level requirements, waiting periods, permits, local sheriff sign-offs. But that patchwork meant your actual level of scrutiny depended entirely on your zip code. Buy a handgun in one state, and a local police chief might personally have to approve the sale. Drive 20 minutes across a state line, and the same purchase might take you 10 minutes with nothing but a signature. And dealers themselves weren't exactly positioned to play detective. Most gun store owners weren't law enforcement. They had no legal way to look up whether the guy in front of them had a felony conviction in another state, or a domestic violence restraining order, or a history of involuntary psychiatric commitment. Even if a dealer was suspicious, even if something about a buyer felt off, there was, quite literally, nothing to check it against. The system wasn't designed to catch anyone in real time. It was designed to create a paper trail for later, assuming there ever was a later. For most transactions, most of the time, this didn't matter, because most buyers weren't prohibited people lying on a form. But most of the time isn't the same as always. And every so often, the honor system's biggest weakness showed up not in a statistic, but in a single, very public moment. It happened on a sidewalk outside a Washington hotel in the spring of 1981, March 30th, 1981. President Ronald Reagan had just finished giving a speech at the Washington Hilton, barely 2 months into his first term. He walked out a side entrance toward his limousine, waving to a small crowd of reporters and onlookers lined up along the sidewalk. It was the kind of routine moment a president does 100 times a year. A wave, a few steps, a car door. Then a 25-year-old named John Hinckley Jr., standing in that crowd, pulled out a revolver and fired 6 shots in under 2 seconds. One bullet hit Reagan, ricocheting off the limousine and lodging near his heart. He'd survive, barely, after emergency surgery. 2 other men were hit and survived, and 1 man went down and didn't get back up the same person he'd been that morning. James Brady, the White House press secretary, standing just a few feet from the president. The bullet hit Brady in the head. He survived, but barely, and not without permanent, severe brain damage. He'd spend the rest of his life partially paralyzed, in a wheelchair, his speech affected, needing care for the remainder of his time on Earth. He was 40 years old. Here's the detail that matters for our story, and it's the detail that would come up again and again over the next decade. Hinckley had bought that revolver, a cheap .22, at a pawn shop in Dallas, months earlier. He'd walked in, filled out the same kind of paperwork everyone filled out, answered the same self-certification questions everyone answered, and walked out with a gun. Nothing in his history had stopped the sale, because nothing in the system was designed to check it. He had a documented history of stalking behavior and had even been arrested at an airport for carrying concealed weapons weeks before the shooting. Arrested, not convicted, and even a conviction on the wrong charge wouldn't necessarily have shown up anywhere a gun dealer could see it. None of that ever touched Form 4473, because Form 4473 only asked Hinckley to tell on himself. James Brady lived for more than 3 decades after that day, and he never went back to being what most people would call a bystander to this story. Alongside his wife, Sarah Brady, he became one of the most visible gun control advocates in the country. Not a background figure, not a name in a footnote, a press secretary, someone whose entire career had been about being in the room, on camera, telling the story, now telling a very different story, in a wheelchair, about how easy it had been for the man who shot him to walk out of a pawn shop with a gun. It would take more than a decade of political fighting for that story to actually change federal law. But it started here, on a sidewalk outside a hotel, with a shooting that lasted less than 2 seconds and changed the rest of James Brady's life. You'd think a shooting like that, a president nearly killed, his press secretary permanently disabled, all of it captured on film and replayed endlessly on the evening news, would be the kind of thing that moves Congress fast. It wasn't. The bill that would eventually bear James Brady's name was first introduced not long after the shooting, and then it just sat there. Year after year, session after session, it got reintroduced, debated, and quietly killed, usually in committee, usually without ever reaching a full floor vote. This went on for the better part of the 1980s. The opposition had a name, and it was a familiar one: the National Rifle Association. The NRA fought the Brady bill with everything it had: lobbying dollars, campaign contributions, grassroots pressure on individual members of Congress who represented gun-friendly districts. Their argument, broadly, was the one you still hear in some form today: that a waiting period and a background check requirement wouldn't stop determined criminals, that it would only inconvenience law-abiding buyers, and that it was a first step toward broader restrictions on gun ownership generally. It was, and remains, one of the most effective lobbying operations in Washington, and for most of the 1980s, it simply outmuscled the bill's supporters. Sarah Brady became, in a lot of ways, the bill's most effective advocate, testifying before Congress, doing interview after interview, standing next to her husband as a living, breathing argument for why this mattered. She chaired what eventually became Handgun Control, Inc., and later the Brady Campaign, and turned what could have been a private family tragedy into a sustained decade-long political campaign. It took until 1993, 12 years after the shooting, for the bill to finally clear both chambers of Congress. The political landscape had shifted by then. A new administration under Bill Clinton was more receptive. Gun violence had become a bigger part of the national conversation through the crack-era crime wave of the late 80s and early 90s, and frankly, 12 years of sustained advocacy had worn down some of the resistance. On November 30th, 1993, President Clinton signed the Brady Handgun Violence Prevention Act into law, with James and Sarah Brady standing beside him. But here's the thing about the law as originally passed, and this is where the story takes an unexpected turn. The Brady Act, as signed, didn't create an instant national background check system. That technology, or at least the political and logistical will to build it, wasn't ready yet. Instead, the law created something more modest and much more fragile, an interim system meant to hold things together for exactly 5 years, while the federal government figured out how to build something better. That interim system was about to run into a problem nobody in Congress had fully anticipated. And it would come, of all places, from a sheriff in rural Montana. So what did the interim Brady law actually require, while the country waited for a real national system to get built? Two things, starting February 28, 1994. First, a 5-business-day waiting period before a licensed dealer could hand over a handgun. Not instant, not same day. 5 days, minimum, between the moment you picked out the gun and the moment you could actually walk out with it. Second, and this is the part that mattered more, and broke first, during that 5-day window, the dealer had to notify the local chief law enforcement officer in the buyer's area. A sheriff, a police chief, whoever held that role locally. And that key LEO was supposed to use the 5 days to make a reasonable effort to determine whether the sale would be legal, checking whatever local, state, and where possible federal records they had access to. Notice the wording there, because it's doing a lot of work. A reasonable effort. Not a mandatory database check. Not a guaranteed answer. An effort using whatever tools happen to be available in that particular county, on that particular day, from that particular office. And that's where the whole thing turned into a patchwork. Because whatever tools happened to be available varied enormously depending on where you lived. A police department in a major city might have decent access to state criminal databases, and a dedicated officer whose job was literally to run these checks. A sheriff's office in a rural county, with 3 deputies covering 1,000 square miles, might have next to nothing. No dedicated staff, limited computer access, and 5 business days that were about to fill up fast with everything else that county already needed those 3 deputies for. Some CLEOs took the responsibility seriously and built out real local processes. Others, frankly, treated it as an unfunded headache dumped on them by Washington. Because, in a lot of ways, that's exactly what it was. Congress had passed a law requiring local law enforcement to do a specific job on a specific timeline without necessarily giving them the money, staffing, or database access to do it well. Applied only to handguns, not to rifles or shotguns, the interim system also left a real gap in what it even covered. Denials happened. The interim system did stop some sales it was supposed to stop. But the inconsistency bothered a lot of people, including a good number of the sheriffs and police chiefs who were the ones actually stuck doing the work. And one of them, in a small county in western Montana, decided he wasn't going to do it at all. His name was Jay Prince, and his objection wasn't really about gun policy. It was about something much more fundamental in American law: whether the federal government could order a local official to carry out a federal program in the first place. That objection was about to make its way all the way to the Supreme Court. Jay Prince was the sheriff of Ravalli County, Montana, a rural county, the kind of place where local law enforcement meant a small department with a lot of ground to cover and not much in the way of resources to spare. When the interim Brady law showed up requiring him to run background checks on behalf of the federal government, on the federal government's timeline, using whatever local systems he could scrape together, he pushed back. He wasn't alone. A handful of other sheriffs around the country felt the same way. But Prince, along with another sheriff, Richard Mack of Arizona, became the named plaintiffs in the case that would actually test the law's constitutionality. Their argument didn't really engage with whether background checks were a good idea or a bad one. It went somewhere more fundamental, back to the basic architecture of American government. The Constitution, they argued, doesn't allow the federal government to simply order state and local officials to carry out federal programs. The federal government can regulate within its own authority, and states can choose to cooperate. But Washington can't reach down and commandeer a local sheriff's department, treat it as an extension of federal law enforcement, and hand it a federal task list with a deadline attached. That's not how the relationship between federal and state government is supposed to work, and it's not a new idea. It goes back to the basic structure of federalism the Constitution was built on. The case reached the Supreme Court, and in June of 1997, in a 5-4 decision, the court agreed. In Prince v. United States, the majority ruled that the interim Brady Law's requirement, forcing local CALEOs to perform these background checks, was unconstitutional. The federal government could ask for cooperation. It could offer incentives, but it could not compel it. And just like that, the enforcement mechanism that had been holding the interim system together, imperfect, patchy, but functional, was gone. Local law enforcement was, from that point on, no longer required to run those checks. Many kept doing it voluntarily, but the mandate was dead. Here's what made this less of a full-blown crisis than it might sound like, though. The ruling didn't strike down the entire Brady Law. And critically, it didn't touch the part of the law that mattered most for where this story is headed. Because the original legislation had always included a built-in expiration date for the interim system. Congress had written the law knowing the waiting period plus local check approach was a stopgap, never meant to be permanent. The text of the Brady Act itself required a truly national computerized system to be up and running by a hard deadline. November 30th, 1998, exactly 5 years after the law was signed. Prince had knocked out one leg of the interim system a year and a half early, but the countdown to the real solution had been ticking the entire time regardless. And now, the FBI had a little over a year left to build, from scratch, a system capable of doing what no local sheriff's office ever could: checking a person's full criminal history from anywhere in the country, in the time it takes to make a phone call. Building a national instant background check system from nothing, in roughly a year and a half, was not a small technical problem. Think about what the FBI actually had to solve. They needed a way for a gun dealer in a strip mall in Ohio, in a pawn shop in rural Montana, anywhere, to reach out, in real time, and get an answer back from records scattered across the entire country. State criminal records, federal criminal records, records of domestic violence restraining orders, records of involuntary psychiatric commitments, records of dishonorable military discharges. None of it lived in one place. Most of it wasn't even digitized in a consistent format. The job fell to the FBI's Criminal Justice Information Services Division, based out of a facility in Clarksburg, West Virginia. Not exactly the first place you'd picture as ground zero for a piece of technology that would reshape how tens of millions of Americans bought firearms, but that's where it happened. The system they built pulled from 3 separate databases simultaneously: the National Crime Information Center, which already existed and tracked things like outstanding warrants; the Interstate Identification Index, which held criminal history records; and a brand-new database built specifically for this purpose, the NICS Index, designed to catch categories of prohibited people who might not show up cleanly in the other two, like certain immigration statuses or documented mental health adjudications. The idea was simple to state and brutally hard to execute. A dealer calls in, or eventually submits electronically. The system checks all 3 databases at once, and in the overwhelming majority of cases, an answer comes back in minutes. Not 5 days, not a reasonable effort, but an actual determination, right there at the counter. On November 30th, 1998, exactly 5 years to the day after Clinton signed the Brady Act and the law's own hard deadline, the National Instant Criminal Background Check System went live. 30 years after the Gun Control Act had first tried to draw a line around who could legally own a firearm, and 35 years after a mail-order rifle bought under a fake name had first put the question on the national radar, there was finally, for the first time, an actual mechanism to check the answer in real time. It wasn't instant perfection. The system launched with real gaps, incomplete state records, mental health adjudications that many states still weren't reporting, and a private sale loophole that meant any case only ever applied to purchases through licensed dealers, not sales between two private individuals at a gun show or over a classified ad. Some of those gaps are still being argued about today, but the fundamental shift was real. For the first time since the federal government had started regulating firearm sales at all, "I promise I'm allowed to buy this" stopped being the whole system and became just the first question in a check that could actually verify the answer. So step back from the dates and the acronyms for a second and look at what this story is actually about. It's not really about guns, not underneath. It's about trust, and how long a country is willing to run something dangerous on trust before it finally demands proof instead. For 30 years, the system asked people a simple question and just believed the answer. Are you a felon? Are you dangerous? Check the box? Sign your name? Walk out the door? And for 30 years, that gap between what the law said and what the law could actually verify sat there quietly, showing up in the worst possible moments. A mail-order rifle, a sidewalk outside a hotel, before anyone with the power to fix it decided it was worth fixing. And even once it got fixed, notice how it happened. Not in one clean moment, but in fits and starts, dragged forward by tragedy, stalled by politics, tripped up by a sheriff in Montana who had a legitimate point about how far Washington's reach should extend. It took an assassinated president, a disabled press secretary, a 12-year lobbying fight, and a Supreme Court case about federalism. And even then, the fix still shipped with holes in it. Because here's the thing, that gap never fully closed. Bring it up to today, and NICE is still running, out of that same building in Clarksburg, processing tens of millions of checks a year. It's denied millions of sales since 1998. But the private sale loophole that existed on day one in 1998 is still, in most states, exactly that. A loophole. A sale between two private individuals, at a gun show or online or over a handshake, still doesn't have to run through NICS at all in a lot of the country. Congress has revisited that gap more than once since 1998, sometimes narrowing it, sometimes leaving it alone. And it remains one of the most contested fault lines in the gun policy debate today. Which is really the pattern running through this entire story, isn't it? A law gets built to close a gap. Everyone agrees is dangerous. It closes most of it. And the part it doesn't close becomes the next fight. That's it for this one. If you learned something, stick around, because there's a lot more of this history that never made it into a textbook. See you in the next one.